start recording. So anyway, on the notes, again, just a reminder, don't let those sit. Get those things done, because you're going to be very disappointed, even if you wrote an absolute gem of a concluding paper. All right. First of all, you've made that work a lot harder on yourself because you haven't kept notes. But even if you have, the best you can do is 70% of the total points. So if you write a great paper, you're still only going to get a C. All right. And that's because writing those notes is a way of participating in the class. It's a way of, because again, you're contributing to the discussion by allowing me to take a look at what your thinking is. And as a consequence of that, kind of integrate that into the discussions. The other thing, though, that I wanted to point out, because I think a lot of times this is misunderstood, is what I see as my role. Full disclosure, I have no interest in most of philosophy. I find that most of it is for people other than me. I'm just not interested, okay? I don't think a lot of the arguments are compelling. I don't think a lot of the discussions are very meaningful for me. They don't inform, much of what I do. And so I've never found philosophy in that sense useful. I am not saying philosophy is not useful, and I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't study philosophy. But what I'm saying is, I don't really have any interest in getting into the philosophical pissing contests that most philosophers do. I'm just not interested. That's an official term, by the way, patent pending. I just am not interested. I don't think there's a lot of value in that, any more than you'll hear me get into exchanges over whether Republicans or Democrats have better policies. That's not my job, okay? And not only that, it's not my interest at all. What I'm interested in doing is trying to help you make sense of these things. And rather than asking yourself who's got the good ideas or whose philosophy is good and whose is bad, I'd like you to start asking yourself, what is there that I can learn from this particular thinker? All right? I don't have to agree with them. I can still learn from them. It's one of the reasons why I'm glad that the authors included Carl Schmitt, because you might think, well, this guy was an apologist for the Nazis. What can I possibly learn from him? A lot. All right. He wasn't an idiot. It's okay to disagree, but you can still be informed by someone's thinking. A lot of you might have no use at all for Karl Marx. It's really hard to argue that the last 100 years have not been influenced by the thinking of Karl Marx. It's nonsense to think that that's possible. All right. So avoiding Marx simply because, you believe in markets as an article of religious faith or something like that is not smart. As my mother used to say, it's not cute, smart, or funny. Okay. It doesn't help anything if you just close the door on, the big crossover for me that I had to come to terms with was existentialism. Because when I first started reading existentialists, I thought I was reading a bunch of self-involved, whiny, pretentious bullshit. It turns out, for the most part, indeed, I was. Okay. Until I read The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is why Simone de Beauvoir has always been an important thinker for me. Because I think she, more than anyone else writing as an existentialist, and particularly Sartre, she helped me to understand why that philosophy can make sense and why it's an important way to think about the world, even if ultimately it's not the one that you choose. And particularly because she doesn't advocate for an immoral society or even necessarily an amoral society. Properly understood, she's saying existentialism is compelling you to think of morality as that which you discover as a consequence of your own life's experience. I think that's valuable. Now, again, I don't have to agree with it, but it makes me think and it makes me want to think, and it keeps me from judging and condemning. Which I mean, if I want to be an absolutist, then what am I doing teaching? I should be in the Soviet Union, except of course the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But you know what I'm saying? In other words, I could go to North Korea and just, pontificate and propagate the faith, but I don't want to do that. I'm much more interested in the discussions that we can have, not by deciding who's right and who's wrong. What are the implications of these ideas and these perspectives? And how do they bounce off of each other? What sort of sparks do they strike? That's more useful to me. Okay. All right. So we're doing a little bit of Clausewitz, Weber, and Schmitt in order to kind of set the tone. One of the things that Fraser and Hutchings do in this book, and it comes out, I think, peculiarly in this chapter, is they talk in a sense about the gendering of these concepts. Okay. I'm not sure about this, but I think I only saw one person who actually made that observation in the notes. It doesn't mean you all missed it, but I think you might be underestimating how important these authors think that is. And it is interesting, for example, that often when people talk about liberalism, when you see liberalism invoked, not so much with Weber, a little bit, but certainly with Clausewitz and certainly with Schmitt, it's sort of equated, and in a pejorative sense, with femininity, as though somehow liberalism is weak. Okay, let me see if I can explain to you why that doesn't make sense. Typically, these thinkers, and they all so far have been male, have equated military virtue with masculinity, okay, without ever stopping to think what makes it masculine, okay? Is it just a question of strength? Because are you really going to tell me that it takes more courage to pick up a gun and shoot someone from 300 yards than it does to tolerate someone who's in your face doing things you find repellent, and you being compelled to tolerate those things because you have no reasonable authority to stop them? I mean, which one really takes more strength of character, right? That's kind of what these authors want you to start to think about, is that gendering this stuff is loaded, okay? It creates this kind of conceptual and intellectual minefield. And I want to suggest to you that being a liberal, not in the American sense of sort of a capital L liberal, which is not really a liberal at all, okay? Like a social justice warrior is not a liberal, because that is a mindset that has baked into it a kind of intolerance, a kind of resolute intolerance. Okay, and I mean as it has happened in the United States. It doesn't mean it's bad or good. It means it's more of an absolutist perspective on the world. Absolutely, there is no reason to tolerate this, therefore we must crush it. Okay, that's not liberalism. Okay, now that might sound courageous, and it might even sound manly, whatever the hell that means. Okay, what I'm trying to suggest is that one of the keys to unlocking that door is Beauvoir. Okay, another is the authors, although they're doing it very subtly. They're trying to get you to think, what's particularly, in a good sense, what is particularly strong about destruction? And does it really take more courage to destroy than it does to create? Okay? Including, by the way, creating a political order. Destroying it takes very little thought and a lot of reflexive, well-trained, fast twitch muscle response. I'm not sure it takes a lot of strength of character to destroy something like a social order or a legal system. I mean, we just saw 4 years of an administration that publicly was committed to destroying much of the institutional infrastructure of the republic. Now, there were hardly any people in the core of that administration who would strike anybody as peculiarly politically adept, but they were very good at going about the business of burning stuff down, or of trying to. But, what I think the authors would have you think philosophically or conceptually is that doesn't mean they're stronger in the sense that masculine should mean strong. It takes us back a step to that notion of, why do many of us still think that strength is a male virtue? It seems nonsensical to me. I don't know how many of you have ever watched a child being born. I was present for the birth of both of my kids and cut the cord on them and actually helped pull one of them out. Okay, that takes a certain kind of courage, but not nearly as much as it took to carry that kid 9 months and then go through the 14 hours of agony to deliver it. That's courage. Okay, that's toughness. And yet, that's about as feminine as you can get. We just don't have the delivery system. All right, we're not in the game. They've got scoreboard. But what I'm saying is, I was a little surprised, I guess, that more of you didn't make that observation of, why would these people do. Oh, I get this. Most of these are old philosophies. I think it's more than that. I think we still have a tendency to do that, to associate, punching someone in the face as being somehow more noble and courageous than avoiding a fight, which is kind of that schoolyard mentality. And it seems to me that if we can't transcend that, then it makes a really compelling case for us to live in a society something like what Carl Schmitt envisioned. Just be obedient to authority and everything will be fine. You know why? There's nothing courageous about it. There's nothing courageous about a bar fight. Nothing. I mean, come on, most of us have seen our share of bar fights. Some of us may indeed, I don't know, maybe have been in a few. Okay, it's not about bravery. It's about survival at that point. Especially if, for somebody as tiny as me, it's just about keeping your teeth in your head. That's not courageous. That's just defense. Okay, so I want us to think about that a little more than maybe some of you have been thinking. This idea of breaking through this tendency to gender these things, particularly in a pejorative sense, somehow to reinforce the notion that those virtues we associate with masculinity are in fact superior, when there's no clear indication that they are. Okay, does that make sense? Again, I'm not you think any way you want to think, but before you do, kind of check yourself at the door and thinking, am I falling into that trap? All right. Okay. Now the next thinker, and I think the one who's probably the least revealing of all of them in the context of our discussions here, is Clausewitz. But what if anything can we learn from Clausewitz that might help us inform our understanding of whatever connection might exist between politics and violence? Other than a very famous and misquoted line.
Wait, what's the very famous and misquoted line?
That war is politics by other means.
Oh.
Which is not.
Well, for sure. He does mention like the uncontrollable nature of states and their interests, the appetites to reel out violence. They all kind of have, Clausewitz along with like Weber and Schmitt also had that kind of idea of like nonviolence is kind of inescapable for different reasons. Whether it's like, I forget if it was Schmitt that agreed with Machiavelli that was saying that it was primordial. Could be wrong on that one. But it's like it's an inescapable part of our nature. So
let's take that point, because that's one of these things about all of these thinkers, is this notion of whether or not violence is inevitable and, as John has said, primordial. Machiavelli, I think would say, violence is part of the human condition. Okay, and does Clausewitz say that?
He said something similar to that, didn't he?
No, I'm not questioning him. I'm saying, what does he say? I mean, how does he go about pursuing? In other words, is he talking about bar fights?
No, I think he was saying it's part of the state, right? Like it was
right.
It has to do with the
nature. It has to do with the nature of states. His perspective then is grounded in a system of nation states. Okay, right. So I'll try not to interrupt you, Ken.
No, it's fine. And actually, just to kind of, because I was thinking about this as you were making like your gender observations, like I was wondering, like it seems, this is more like an opinion that I was kind of developing as you were talking, like if like violence is inevitable, it's kind of interesting that we see that as like a strength or the virtue, when it's like, it seems to be like the more passive thing. If like we're so violent, then we don't have to do anything to be violent. Like it seems to be a natural and inevitable part of us, if it's so primordial, according to Machiavelli and Schmitt.
We're going to come back to that because it's a fair observation, but I don't think it's consistent. And I don't think you're saying it's consistent with Clausewitz's thinking. But one of the things we notice, right, is that unlike Machiavelli, he doesn't romanticize war.
Right. It's very black and white, matter of fact, this needs to happen if this happens, like an existential threat. He was talking about the existential threat, right? Right.
Right.
And that's the only way it's justifiable, if I understood correctly.
Well, is that right? In other words, is Clausewitz saying the only way to justify violence is self-defense?
I was getting that confused with Schmitt, actually. I apologize.
I know, and that's right. But does Clausewitz at least imply that, or is he saying something different from that. First of all, his argument is situated in a world of sovereign nation states. He's talking a lot less about, he's not talking about private violence at all.
Yeah, he definitely mentions war as one of the tools that governments have for pursuing state policy, but he also saw it as like the military can educate citizens to virtue. In that kind of way, it kind of echoes Machiavelli,
It
right?
does.
Where it's more seen as a virtuous trait. War is virtuous in that kind of sense.
Well, is war virtuous, or does the prosecution of war demand virtue, which is something different?
I guess it depends.
I'm not trying to put you on. I mean,
no, for sure.
This is to the general class. Which of those do you think would be closer to Clausewitz's thinking, that war is a virtuous, noble thing, or that in order to prosecute the techniques of war demands of people certain kinds of virtue? Because that's a different argument. I would suggest that that's a different kind of argument.
I would say that it's more like the latter, that like not war is a virtue, but that like it is necessary to uphold things. Because like he said specifically, like war is just, it says war is simply a continuation of political intercourse with addition of other means. And that it's like the way for governments to further policy and further like action through war and violence.
And also, that's right, Rachel, but to further action to the good of the state, right? And the implication being the good of the state and its people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You could argue that that's not all that far away from Machiavelli, considering the big gulf of time between those two thinkers. That Machiavelli isn't saying, either in his version of The Art of War or in The Prince or the Discourses, he's not saying that the prince can accumulate personal capital through war and that that's a good and noble thing. That's not his argument. It's a common misconception about Machiavelli, is that a Machiavellian leader is not a psychopath. A Machiavellian leader is, in fact, suffering under and laboring under a number of obligations, the most principal of which is to preserve the principality, right? In order to do that, violence is necessary. That's very different from someone who reads Machiavelli as saying, hey, if you want to throw down and get violent, that's great. You're the prince, you can do anything you want. Nowhere does Machiavelli say that. It's the same kind of thing. But would you guess, for example, that Clausewitz read his Machiavelli when he was in school? I think Weber did too. Yeah.
For sure they all did. I would assume they would.
Yeah, I mean, he was an incredibly influential thinker. It's like liberals having read John Locke.
Right.
You know,
I was going to more.
Oh, go ahead. So, I'm sorry. We got.
No, I was going to more.
No,
it's okay. I was going to more say, like, for me, Machiavelli was always more about order. It's very realpolitik, right? Where it's just about like the again, going back to like a black and white framework. Like, well, if there's an uprising, I need to quell that uprising. It's better to be feared to be loved, that kind of thing.
Well, but the reason is because it advances the interests of the principality.
Right.
There's no point in having power if you're not going to use it. Because you use it to the benefit of the principality and its people. Does Clausewitz give us much insight? I mean, he talks about politics and he talks about how can we do this? He talks about, when he talks about war as one of the methods applied to policy, he talks about other things too, in terms of the actions of a state, right? In other words, it's not just war. That's why I say when people misread him as saying that war is politics by other means, that's not what he's saying. In other words, it's what Rachel suggested. It's, the continuation of politics with the addition of other means. But what are the other means of politics? What makes politics? Does Clausewitz give us a definition of politics?
I mean, he doesn't, not that I'm seeing, give us like a direct definition of politics, but rather like political power, and talks about the like the paradoxical trinity.
That's what I was looking for. Yeah.
Of the political power, that's political power, violence, and chance, and like primordial violence, the hatred of the enemy, and stuff like that, that all works together to create the like that underlies the reality of war.
Well, it doesn't just underlie the reality of war. It underlies the reality of statecraft. I think that's what I was going for. When I said politics, I probably should have said what's sometimes called statecraft. That is the whole, the art of advancing the interests of a state, right? Because, I mean, think about that part of his trinity is hate. You know, he's pretty, you know, does that mean that hate's a good thing? Was Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys right when he said at the Def Club in 1980, I think, it's fun to hate?
I think that he's saying that like that does come out in War and Violence, that it's sort of like a not really central to his political philosophy, I don't think, but that when it does come to War and Violence, that comes out in people. But I did want to mention him saying that like political proceedings are sort of what he says or what the authors say is a specific mode of response to like the realm of human action.
And what does that help us understand that? That's correct, but help us understand that. What should we take away from that? Does that mean it's inevitable? Does that mean it's virtuous? Does that mean, you know, what does it mean?
I think what he is saying is it is inevitable to statecraft, that violence is inevitable to statecraft. But I'm not sure that he really, I don't think he's like advocating, he's saying that it's a good thing.
Okay, I think that's an important distinction though, because one of the things that I wanted you to think about was there's a very brief description in there of war. And remember, he's writing as a career fighting man, okay? And he's seen a lot of war. And unlike Machiavelli, the authors point this out too, right? Machiavelli was responsible for helping to send people to war at various times, but Machiavelli was not a soldier necessarily. Clausewitz was a soldier, right? He was a fighter, and he was a general, and he was a brilliant one, okay? When he describes war, it doesn't sound romantic. And, you know, I mean, I don't know how many or if any of you have had combat experience or military experience, but part of that, an important part of that training is to prepare you for that. Because when he talks about chance, that's part of it. The things that happen on a battlefield can be chaotic, and people talk about the fog of war. That notion that, well, everything was happening so fast. There were so many things going on simultaneously. What always amazes me is that people can make smart decisions under those circumstances. But what Clausewitz, I think, is trying to explain, kind of building on the point that Julian raised, is this happens, and it's horrifying. And people die, and people are maimed, and, you know, horrible things happen. He's not trying to say this is a great thing. But is he saying, you know what, it may not be a great thing, but either is a forest fire, but they happen. It's almost like he's describing, sorry, who did I interrupt?
That was me, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but he is saying that it is virtuous, though. He is saying that like nothing can educate people in the spirit of boldness, right? And that it's the only like counteract the softness and the desire of like prosperity and trade. Kind of like, I think Machiavelli was also
very much like Machiavelli.
Similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would suggest to you that what he's really talking about there is preparation for war. The discipline involved in the preparation for war. not just the experience of war itself, which can shatter lives, but that notion of the esprit de corps of it, the training, the ability to respond under pressure, all those things can instill in people various things that we would acknowledge to be virtues. He's saying, is that right?
Yeah, he does talk about like the orderliness of like a drills or such.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Now, what Machiavelli was trying to argue, remember, was that these weak, feminine people living this indulgent market life of buying and selling and luxury and all this kind of stuff, you know, we've got a remedy for that. Train them to be soldiers, right? Make them citizen soldiers, thereby instilling in them the discipline and virtue of barracks life, right? Without which they would just be overly indulgent and, let's face it, effeminate. Okay, he's kind of saying that. Is Clausewitz saying the same thing?
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
It kind of seems like he was operating on the same kind of idea. I mean, in my opinion, I would think that he definitely read Machiavelli because he seems to share some of those opinions anyway. You only seem to really disagree with maybe Hobbes, I think.
Well,
But
in other words, would Clausewitz have supported the use of the military within the state, not against other states, but within the state against its people? Now, again, that's not clear from this little discussion and excerpt, but what do you think?
Can you
I
hear
think
me
it
okay?
might depend. Sorry.
What would it depend on?
I would think it depends on the self-preservation of this, not of the individual, but maybe of the state. Like, does it threaten the state? I would think. I could be wrong on that. No, it's
Well,
not
no,
clear.
let's
I don't
think
to
about
me.
that. I mean, it seems like that would not be on its face, given what we've talked about so far with Clausewitz, that his primary concern is, in a very Machiavellian sense, is the preservation of the state, taking actions to the benefit of the state and its people, right? Well, then that seems to me would include not only threats from outside, but threats from within as well. But having said that, does Clausewitz then, would you think, make the case for a military dictatorship?
I don't think he doesn't make the case for one. A lot of the other philosophers like Hobbes, etc., they talk about the consent of the governed, and everything is like that's sort of their main driving considerations. But with Clausewitz, it's like the three ingredients: the chance thing, the military preparedness, and I'm sorry, I'm away from my book right now. I can't remember the other one. And I think that the dictatorship, he might argue, would be the best way to facilitate military preparedness, which would be the best way to facilitate safety, which as as Hobbes might say, would lead to an overall reduction in violence over the long term. That's just my idea of what he'd say.
Okay, so would you said you started with an interesting assertion that, by way of answering the question, first of all, acknowledging that Clausewitz doesn't necessarily frame the question so that he can address it. Am I understanding you right? That he doesn't actually come out and say,
yeah, because he lives,
military supersede civilian government?
Because like he was a monarchist. He had fought against Napoleon. The only things that he'd ever seen were, for the most part, monarchy, like usually absolute monarchy, and the giant, horrifying French revolutionary monster I can't remember who said it, was somebody in the French Revolution. It was like Saturn devouring its own children. And then Napoleon, another giant scary thing that, beat his own country into a pulp, and they barely managed to trundle him off to an island in obscurity. So I think dictatorship in the modern sense would have been outside of his frame of reference.
Okay, I think that's probably the more accurate response, and now I understand you better. I don't think that Clausewitz is making the case for military rule. Even in a monarchy, ultimately, the source of legitimacy is not the command and control of the military. The source of legitimacy is a divine right to rule, or at least the recognized right, even of a tyrant, to rule. Okay, it's not necessarily the case that every monarch is a warrior. Okay, but there's no question that he seems to understand the importance, and I think this is what Johanna was saying. He seems to understand the inescapable conclusion that, irrespective of the system of government, and he did not have any real living knowledge of democracy, of course, whatever the system is, you live in a violent world. You have a tumultuous society with conflicting interests. You have to make sense of those. You have to order society. And the main reason is because if you don't do that, the state doesn't survive. If the state doesn't survive, it collapses amid a system of hostile or potentially hostile nation states. That there are essentially two ends of politics, right? One is alliance and the other is conquest. Those take military thinkers. So that if not a military style government, at least a prominent place at some place on the table for the military mind. He talks about the excellence of the mind of the general and things like that. And there is something to that. We forget that a lot of these successful generals really, with respect to strategy and tactics, were really brilliant. All right. And so, yeah, I mean, we have to keep in mind the time at which he's writing, and as Jonathan suggested, the consequences of his own experience. In other words, the existentialist in us is saying, oh, well, wait a minute, his notion of morality is conditioned by his life's experience. His life experience doesn't include vibrant, stable democracy. So why would he advocate that? He wouldn't, okay? A little bit of military discipline enforced by military rule to impress. Can you just say that with your microphone on?
Yeah. Just based on his kind of extensive military experience and what seems to be his understanding about how awful conflicts tend to be, I kind of got the impression that his desire to impress that sort of military discipline on his population was kind of driven by a protective factor to harden them because of the violent world that they live in, so that, if it came to conflict, that society had a better chance of surviving because it was already preconditioned to be able to deal with the rigors of something like that. That was kind of just...
Well, yeah, and again, I think as Johanna was saying earlier, then that would be sort of the Machiavellian in him, saying, well, no, there's a virtue in that kind of ordered, disciplined life, sort of like the life within the barracks. But he's not necessarily saying that everyone should be. He's not advocating Sparta. Okay, he's not. But he is saying there is virtue, and this was, I think, Johanna's point. There is virtue in having an experience of that kind of hierarchy and of that kind of discipline. Yeah. Okay. Well, what about Max Weber? Max Weber is a very enigmatic character in a lot of ways. He's also very transitional for us because, unlike Clausewitz, Weber does have experience of institutional democracy. He sees it developing. He sees what he believes to be the virtues of liberalism, but he also sees the problems inherent in liberalism. And it seems to me that one of the ways to understand Max Weber is to understand him as trying to square the circle of the potential for chaos and uncertainty in liberalism, but also the virtue of sovereignty being invested in the people, and of freedom vested in the individual, right? He's trying to come to terms with those things, but he's doing that with an experience of social chaos and dislocation. Remember, rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization. A lot of times we forget, you know, that these are societies that are really, really coming to have to learn, often agonizingly, about the challenges of simply running large metropolitan settlements of human beings, cities, and how chaotic that can be. Remember that at the time, at least in his early writings, the notion of a regular domestic police force is still new. Okay, there is still an open question as to how best to police the streets, how best to get goods and services, delivered where they're needed, how best to take care of healthcare, how best to take care of education, how best to provide safe water, how best to deal with disease and plague and all these kinds of things, and then how best to deal with the inevitable criminality that's going to characterize any compressed, collection of humanity. He's trying to deal with all of that. This is why he's so important to us in terms of the early origins of sociology, because those are the kinds of questions that really keep sociologists awake at night, or at least if they don't, they should. So where is he in all of this? Where does he see violence in political process?
He definitely believes violence should be, or it seems to believe that violence is necessary to preserve the state. And from what I gathered, it seems like it's okay to even inflict violence internally, not necessarily just externally. So if it seems like if there was like a rebellion, he would be okay with violence to suppress that. In my opinion anyway. And when it comes to like the external side, I actually, just more like a side note, like I found it fascinating that he saw it as like external war against an external threat, or an external threat, like seeing it as more of a spiritual sense, like seeing it as more like people dying for something, kind of like, like almost like a patriotism, like a spiritual kind of like component to it, I guess.
Well, this is interesting because that's going to contrast him with people like Schmidt, who doesn't quite see that. But I think the first box to tick with Max Weber is that he's, I would say, unequivocal in his very definition of the state requiring that monopoly of coercive violence. And that means internal coercion. That means violence against dissent and disorder. Okay, so that, he wants to make sure that the integrity of the structure is preserved, that the rule of law is respected, because his understanding that if you don't have that, you don't have a state. If you don't have a state, then you don't have security. Is there liberalism, small l, liberalism in Max Weber?
I mean, liberalism is supposed to be more like the individual, like exercising like their free will to do X, Y, Z, right?
All right. Is
Right.
that obviated by Weber? Does Weber dismiss that?
I would say that's dismissive. If he feels that because if and I could be incorrect about this, but kind of like Hobbes, where you're sacrificing like your individual right to violence and giving that to the state, that by definition is like you giving up some of that liberty to rebel, right?
Well, remember that the notion of liberal freedom isn't just the freedom to rebel. Okay. Now, I know that's an important component of Locke, although I think it's often misstated. I don't think that Locke is, I think we talked about this already. I'm going to make the case that I don't think Locke is talking about a right to revolution, to the destruction of the existing system, just paving it over into a field of glass. I don't think that's what Locke's talking about. Okay. But I'm going to be disagreed with on that, and that's fine. I'm just going to keep fighting that long retreat. Does Max Weber dismiss democracy? Remember the component of democracy that's most important, that sovereignty is vested in the people. Is he saying that sovereignty is vested in the state and the coercive power of the state? Or does he believe that sovereignty, political sovereignty, is or ought to be invested in the people? Is he dismissive of that?
I'm honestly, personally, I'm not sure. Like, I would think
Oh,
that
he
if
doesn't make it
you're-
easy.
No, yeah. I mean, if I had to take a stab at it, I mean, I would say it would be acceptable in a democratic institution, but I'm not sure.
That's okay. I mean, look, if the existentialists can be professionally ambiguous, so can we. But here's the thing to think about with liberalism. If we go back and we do sort of Locke 2.0, that is, we do Locke for the industrial world. One of the things that Locke talks about is how the conditions were not necessary for us to sustain a life in the state of nature, right? We had to leave the state of nature. Why did we have to leave the state of nature?
Survival.
Well, just survival, just physical survival?
Well, it was like, I mean, we're social animals, right? So we tend to congregate. So part of it is survival.
But the state of nature
it's also
isn't about
defense.
isolated
Sorry.
individuals. Okay, the state of nature is
Right.
not about isolated individuals.
It's about coming together as like a group, right? A social group.
That happened in the state of nature,
Right.
according to Locke. In other words, we were still social animals. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just saying that,
Oh,
go ahead.
it was about like violence against each other, right? It's protection from violence.
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, the law of nature is reason. In a reasoned world, we would not commit an act of violence against someone without provocation. If no one ever provokes anyone, there need be no violence. And yet, people were forever putting themselves where? In a state of war by violating that law of reason. And it was for that, out of that dilemma, that we left the state of nature and created civil societies. Okay, so that what we agreed was we're going to sacrifice, or we're going to donate some measure of our personal liberty in order to enhance our ability to be secure in our lives, our persons, and our property, and our liberty. Okay, so we'll still maintain liberty, but it won't be the absolute perfect freedom of the state of nature, because we can't preserve that, because people will forever put themselves into a state of war against us. Okay, and so that requires the intervention of what? A state of some kind, right? And the idea, though, is that the core sovereignty of that state is still its people. Why? Because the government can only operate with consent. The source of consent is the real source of sovereignty in liberalism as a philosophy, right? This is what Locke would argue, that the sovereignty remains with the people because the government requires their consent in order to govern. Rachel, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
I was just going to touch on a little bit of like Hobbes, what he was saying specifically about like the state of nature.
Okay.
And like the reason that we leave the state of nature is to escape a worse violence.
Yes. And you mentioned that in your notes as well.
Yeah, that there is violence in both, but we're entering the violence of the social contract to get away from the even worse violence.
And what's the even worse violence? You mentioned it in your notes.
Yeah, I'm forgetting
Anarchy.
exactly what I said.
Anarchy.
Yes, anarchy.
Anarchy.
Yes.
Okay, so in that sense, we could argue that Locke and Hobbes are kind of on the same page. In other words, Locke, perhaps because of his religious faith, perhaps for other reasons, is more optimistic about the nature of the human animal than is Hobbes. Okay, he's also had a significantly different experience of life. Okay, but do you see what I'm trying to do here? In other words, I'm trying to make the case, even under liberalism, for a state that has coercive power. Because can you have the rule of law if you don't have an institution of enforcement?
No.
Right, because we
absolutely not.
can't be
There's no
relied
reason.
upon merely voluntarily to obey the law. If we did, we would be where? Back in a state of nature. We tried that in a state of nature and it didn't work. Right?
That's why you have the monopolization of violence
Exactly.
by the state.
And so
Yeah,
that's what I
okay.
wanted you to consider, is that one way to think, I know I feel like I'm talking too much today, I'm sorry, but this is interesting stuff, is that for Weber, he wants kind of both bites of the apple. He wants the stability and order that can only be ensured by a strong state, but he doesn't want to annihilate the core of liberalism, which is the sovereignty of the people and the freedom of the individual. So what he's trying, I'm trying to make a case here, feel free to push back, but the case I'm trying to make is he's trying to balance out the need for security against the human emancipation of liberalism and find a balance between those two. He does not want to enslave humanity. You know, in other words, Hobbes can be said to be arguing in exchange for security, you have to give us obedience. You have to give, the sovereign is not any longer the people necessarily, except very broadly written. The sovereign is the Leviathan. Now he argues the Leviathan is the will of the people because it's the will of the people to be secure in their lives, liberty, and property, particularly their lives and property, right? And if the sovereign is acting by the will of the people, then it is the embodiment of that will. Therefore, it is the embodiment of popular sovereignty. In other words, the only mechanism of popular sovereignty is not free and fair election. Okay. But I don't think that Hobbes would argue that that's democracy. Right?
I mean,
I
it
don't
could
think
be
the Leviathan
passive,
is
right?
necessarily supposed to be democratic.
Right. It could be passive acceptance of a monarch or some type of centralized leadership, right?
It could be a monarch. It could be a bureaucracy. It could be a
Right.
Soviet state. It could be any number of things. But the idea is it has to guarantee you your security. Okay. But part of guaranteeing you your security is having the power to police the actions of your neighbors who would otherwise impinge upon your liberty and your security. In other words, life for Hobbes, life under the Leviathan is not a gulag. There still is an arena of civil interaction that the state has no part of. As long as you abide by the contract that created the Leviathan, you're free to buy and sell and have commerce and things like that. You're free to associate with people and do everything else. But what you give up, of course, is the right to act, just as you wouldn't leaving liberalism under lock. You can't act as your own judge. You can't act as your own enforcer. You can't be a law unto yourself. You have to be obedient to the existing superstructure of law, which is, the sort of leading edge of the Leviathan. Okay.
I feel like I've always interpreted the Leviathan as like a dictatorship in the sense of like, you don't really have freedoms under the Leviathan. You have like what's given to you, but they can be taken away as soon as it poses any sort of threat to the like overall security and like safety that is guaranteed under the Leviathan. So like you're giving absolute submission to it to guarantee any sense of like
Yeah. Well, it is a way to read the Leviathan. I'm not sure it's the only way to read the Leviathan any more than it is the only way to read Max Weber. But fast forwarding again to get back to where we left off with Johanna's point, and no, Johanna, I'm not meaning to put you on the spot. You're not on the stand again, but to pick up where we left off, the dilemma is there any liberalism in Max Weber? Well, if there's any liberalism in John Locke, and by definition there is, I would suggest to you that there is some bit of that notion that what he's not talking about is an absolute and capricious authority. He's not talking about a dictatorship. He's talking about a strong state, but he's not talking about a dictatorship. And the reason why I want to emphasize that point is when we get to Carl Schmitt, he's talking about a dictatorship. Okay? He's clear. He's talking about a dictatorship. But we'll get to that.
Right.
I'm
Well,
not
he's
sure
also
how
saying
meaningful
that.
this is.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Julian.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure how meaningful this is in this context, but the sort of way he described.
When you say he,
Oh,
Weber?
sorry. The way Weber describes the like separation of sort of like the general public and like civil servants and political officials reminded me a little bit of how I believe it was Plato in the Republic, is like people kind of have their own like things to do and they're sort of in their own element and they should be able to do those things. But sort of against that notion that he's saying people can be inclined to participate in policymaking, but that if they're going to do that, that they need to be able to like confront physical violence because that is an inherent part of it.
Yeah, okay. And so, I mean, we could take that in a few different ways. Let me see. I may not be framing the question right. Let me back up and try this again. Okay. With the notion of liberalism. Okay. Does a liberal society, in order to remain liberal, have to be a democracy?
I don't think so, right? You could still have liberty under a monarchy, because
Well,
like it
okay.
depends on the restrictions of that
Is the
liberty.
United States a democracy?
No, it's a republic.
Okay. First of all, it's a republic, and that's important, right? It's a republic. We don't have very much direct authority over policy. Now, we do have, unlike some other systems in the world, we don't always make productive use of it, but we do have the sort of initiative referendum process. But that's only state by state. We don't do that nationally. Some other countries do. Okay, think about Brexit, all right? Brexit was settled by being put to a national vote. That's democracy. And yet we know that there are many elements of the British system that are not democratic, the least of which is the monarchy anymore. Okay. So the first thing I want to think about being able to uncouple is the inevitability that every liberal system must be democratic. Remember, the idea is that there just needs to be a mechanism of consent. Okay. Some way of gauging consent and being able manifestly to withhold that consent if the government should become corrupt or tyrannical. Okay. It seems to me that that's not necessarily what a lot of people would think of as a democracy. In other words, a liberal system does not require the popular sovereignty of a jury trial. It doesn't require it. Now, most of the liberal systems have that. Okay. But I don't know that it necessarily requires it. Okay. And we know that going from state to state, different systems run their jury trials differently, or that, for example, like a grand jury can either be very small, like the grand jury I sat on was 6 people. It can also be 15. Okay. There's not a single set of rules without which that ceases to be liberal. Okay. So the first thing is, well, if we're thinking about systems that have the elements of liberalism in them, we don't necessarily have to have a system that looks like the United States or looks like Britain or whatever. Okay. But when we're talking about a liberal system, the fundamentals of liberalism, I would argue, are popular sovereignty, individual liberty, and the one that's always left out, tolerance. There has to be tolerance. You cannot have liberalism without having as a core value of your society tolerance. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Tolerance. Why am I arguing that that's a fundamental liberal principle that is too often ignored, particularly by 21st century Americans?
I could be wrong about this, but I would say because you have to, if you don't tolerate another individual's right to live their life, I guess, how they choose to, then you in essence are trying to control that life, and it's kind of contradictory to what the nature of it would be, a nature of liberalism in that sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. That liberalism, insofar as it empowers the freedom of the individual, requires tolerance of the expression of that freedom by one individual with another. You have to have a tolerant society. And so one of the things we have to think about when we think about Max Weber, Rachel, I'll get to you in 1 second, okay, is the idea that it's an open question as to what the the general level or acceptance of tolerance was in the society within which he was writing and within which he had been educated. And German liberalism is really emerging at this time, but it's almost immediately getting a lot of pushback, from a variety of sources. Okay, I'm sorry, Rachel, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that I think it's also interesting to consider that, like, in order to maintain and uphold like a tolerant society, it would require like the intolerance of intolerant people. And like there's that whole level of like the confusing part of it, that is it true tolerance if you're intolerant of some people, but can you have a tolerant society without removing intolerant people?
Well, or you may not be able to remove them, but you can place legal limits on their capacity to express their intolerance. Okay, well, yeah, of course you can. Yes. What's the key to it remaining liberal? The
That's still
consent
the
of the
state.
governed.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I was saying, would that be the state? Because you would still need that kind of protection.
No, it is.
But
You're not
so
wrong.
then-
You're not wrong. But remember, the state, in a liberal society, the state acts as an embodiment of the will of the sovereign people. Well, let me say that better. The sovereign will of the people. The sovereign will of the people is their consent to be governed. Because as individuals, they can't stop, the predatory bigot from going around and, doing all kinds of terrible things and harassing your kids and making fun of people and starting fights and disrupting the social order and, refusing to educate their children and all kinds of other things. So what do? You consent to allow the state to require all of your kids have to have a K through 12, or at least a 1 through 12 education with almost no exceptions. And that's a fairly uniform education. And you see what I'm saying? In other words, we consent to those things. If we didn't consent to them, that would be tyranny. Okay. And so part of what we consent to is we grant the state a certain authority, and it's varied over time, right? To put impediments in the way of intolerant people or groups. So that, for example, in Germany, it's illegal, really, it's illegal to be a Nazi, but it's more illegal to form a group that espouses the principles of Nazism. Okay, and that's unusual that a liberal or tolerant society would outlaw an entire bandwidth of political views. And yet functionally, it has done that. The United States functionally outlawed communism from the end of the 40s throughout the 1960s in a variety of ways, right? I mean, the Democrats in Congress, including Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy, passed legislation that would have created concentration camps for communists. And yet we think of ourselves as a tolerant liberal society with the, governed by or limited by the consent of the sovereign people. Okay, sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I completely apologize if this is going like way off topic, and if so,
well, we've expanded the scope.
Yeah, I'm wondering just how, like, in this conversation that we're having about like allowing the state to set certain regulations in the sense of like the consent of the governed, I wonder how, like, especially now that it's coming out more, especially public universities requiring the vaccine for attendance, like in the fall. Like, I'm just wondering how like that piece of it fits in, like the consent of the governed, because yeah, I just want to know your opinions on that.
Yeah, Julian. Look at how I skated across that.
I think that what we are kind of like coming up against right now in this conversation is an expansion on what you were saying about legal limits on intolerance, that it's there's a greater good, I guess. There's the importance of public health, the importance of people being able to feel like their government is protecting them in this contract that we've come up with, that it sort of outweighs the promise, or I don't know another word to say for that, but the idea of someone being able to do what they want in a liberal sense, I guess. That
I think you raise a good point. I mean, the real basic version of that is that liberty is not license. That granting a certain amount of personal autonomy or personal sovereignty within liberalism does not mean you get to do whatever you want all the time. The other thing, Rachel, I have to be honest about is I'm not aware of exactly what the articulated official policy of this university is with respect to being on campus and not being vaccinated. For example, I can tell you there was no requirement that I get vaccinated. None. So I can't speak to it, is what I'm saying. I'm not denying what you're saying. I'm not aware of that policy. If there were, I think Julian would be right in saying, and I think this gets us back to Max Weber's very modern notion of the state, because it's Max Weber's version of the state that really captures both the bureaucratic structure of the state and also the kind of, I don't know, the metaphysical existence of the state kind of going forward. Every theory of the state, to some extent, is informed by that, okay? Certainly every liberal theory of the state. So I would say there that the idea would be, as Julian suggested, that the state intervening in that way, like I can tell you one thing I was required to do, okay? There were things I was required to do. When polio was still a problem, and mine was the last generation with living memory of, say, friends of mine who had polio, right? Or maybe their older brothers and sisters usually had polio, okay? And it was an incredibly debilitating disease. It was horrible. We were required as students in public schools to go in and get these things called skin tests. And they'd stick a little needle in you, and if you had a reaction to what they put under your skin, then it meant that you had functionally tested positive for tending toward that. I think I'm wrong. I think that was actually for tuberculosis, come to think of it. Tuberculosis, yeah. I mean, it was all a blur when I was a little kid. It was needles. I hated them. I can't believe I had the courage to stand in line and get a needle shoved in me without falling over. I don't think I could do that today. But the idea was everyone accepted that because, like, my mom's original father died of tuberculosis when he was 30. Okay. And it's a horrible way to go. And there were a lot of people from her generation who had the experience of family members of theirs who died of tuberculosis. It was an incredibly debilitating disease. We all but eliminated it in the United States. We did that with things like the skin tests and other things. We eliminated polio with the Salk vaccine and things like that. Okay. But when I went to graduate school, I had to get more inoculations because I was of a generation who had been inoculated against, I think it was the MMR, whatever. But at that time, there was like, no, it's been too long. We've got a better inoculation. If you want to be a student at this university, you have to get this. The reason for that being, I made the choice. It's a public university, and I made the choice. I didn't have to go to graduate school. So I had to make a choice as to, well, now, could I have gotten a religious exemption to that? I don't know, because it never crossed my mind, and I'm not religious, and I'm also not a hypocrite. But it's possible that I could have stated a religious objection and been allowed not in some way to forego that. Okay. But this whole thing, this is the notion of liberalism. This is the fundamental challenge of liberalism. So you see how tolerance kind of cuts both ways. In order for us to be secure, all right, we have to tolerate certain actions of the state, certain impositions on our personal sovereignty. In order for us to be free, we have to tolerate the freedom of others within society. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, say no, Bill, it doesn't make. Well, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I actually wanted to connect that to what we're actually what we're reading, because we do talk about.
Which is what I want you to do.
Oh, well, we do talk about external threats to the state, right? In
Yes.
essence, you could see COVID as an external threat to the
Yes.
health and well-being of its populace, and therefore you need to fight that. And that would be one way of doing so, considering previous generations' experience where we have eliminated certain things.
That was kind of the direction I was going in, was that, how often have we seen this addressed metaphorically as war? It's a fundamental existential threat to
Constantly.
the social order. And you know what? It is. It is. Okay. Whether you like it or not, it is. And so under those circumstances, there has to be a way to coerce people into complying for their own good, and more importantly, for the good of the stable society within which they hope to exist. Okay, so this is where Max Weber he's really caught here. He's in that most difficult of positions. He's kind of in the center, right? He's not a socialist in the sense that he believes in the big, caretaker superstate or anything like that. Okay. He's not a libertarian, obviously. I would suggest to you that in many ways, his is a version of modern industrial liberalism. It's not, I would argue that it's not inconsistent with the principles of liberalism interpreted to, the early 20th century. Okay, but again, I'm not telling you that you have to argue that way. But I think the dilemma for Weber is to try and reconcile the need for a coercive capacity within the state with the obligation of the state to protect people's their sovereignty as a people, that is, to acknowledge some democratic oversight of state actions, and simultaneously to maximize, where possible, the freedom of the individual. And that ain't easy. So that's why Weber's theory of the state, inspires so many other thinkers on, state theory and state society relations. Okay. All right. I think we've given a pretty good treatment of that. This is a substantive discussion. Okay. In many ways, the most problematic of these thinkers is the last one we're dealing with here. Now, I mentioned, I think the last thing I said last week was something about Schmidt having joined the Nazi Party in 1933. He did. He hadn't been at least a public supporter of the Nazis before then. He also, though, beyond that, I almost feel like I'm poisoning the well a little bit here, but I don't know how much you know about Carl Schmitt. Fascinating individual. There was a movement within Nazi Germany, which actually predates Nazi Germany, which was to reduce or eliminate so-called Jewish influence from German law. Okay. And once the Nazis came to power and Schmitt became important within the party as a legal scholar, jurist, he embraced that. He embraced it publicly, enthusiastically. If you look at his writings, he's either doing a great job of faking it because he wants to advance within the party, and that is one theory, right? That indeed the Nazis developed themselves about him, was that he was just an opportunist, okay? Or he really believes that there was a pernicious influence exercised by German Jews over the German legal system, okay? He supported the extra-legal killings of people under Hitler. He created a lot of the legal thinking of the time that justified that as necessary and proper, okay? A lot of views that we would consider to be very extreme. And if you look at his political theology and his concepts of politics, he pretty clearly seems to advocate dictatorship. Okay? What does he tell us, at least in the brief excerpt here, which almost does no justice to him because he's a very enigmatic and complex fellow. I don't know how enigmatic he is, but he's certainly complex. What does that tell us about the role for violence that he sees? First of all, is he a liberal? He's absolutely militantly opposed to liberalism. He hates it. What is he?
Oh, a statist? I mean, he seems
He's
to
a statist. Yes, he is.
he talks very much about the existential threat, and so it's like now that I've learned, because I wasn't familiar with him beforehand, admittedly, and so now that I'm hearing that he's part of the Nazi Party, he's trying to expel like Jewish influence from like laws. It kind of makes sense if he saw it as an existential threat to the collective good of like Germans or whatever.
I think that's right. I think that's fair. In other words, he has a very strong sense. Now again, we're reading an excerpt here, but he has a very strong sense of the importance of national identity and the purity of that national identity. He's not necessarily talking about the Aryans or anything like that, but there is a sense that one of the roles of the bureaucratic structure of the state is to preserve the integrity of the nation. Okay. And so certainly by 1933, one of the most profound internal threats to the integrity of the German nation is German Jews. Okay. And so this is why, he very, very aggressively supports the idea of mitigating and eliminating that influence. Okay. So he sees what if I'm trying to do justice here. If Max Weber is concerned about the integrity of popular sovereignty and that it can only be protected by a relatively strong state, okay, we could argue that what Carl Schmitt is primarily concerned with is the integrity of the nation state, the complete fusion of the bureaucratic and juridical boundaries of the state and the kind of people who inhabit that. In this case, the German people, right? And so this is why you can see, okay, well, yeah, all right, then I guess Nazism was in 1933 was the way to go, whatever. But I think it's important to understand Schmitt as the ultimate consolidation of anti-liberalism in the early 20th century of Germany, carrying right into the years of the Nazis, because the opposition to liberalism didn't start with Hitler and the Nazis. It actually goes back to the late 19th century, either because there were people who were monarchists or people who were militarists, various kinds of authoritarians, whatever they were. If you look at sort of Bismarckian Germany or something like that, I mean, that's not really a liberal order, okay? But it gradually gives way to that in some ways, at least in various parts of the pre-unified German state, right? The other thing a lot of people forget about Germany, even in 1930, it hasn't been unified for very long. It hasn't really, in fact, it goes through another process of enforced unification during the Second World War and the run-up to the Second World War. Okay, so there, in other words, there's a lot of turmoil within the various parts of Germany. There's a lot of unrest. There's a lot of unrest on the left. There's labor unrest. There were the revolutions of 1848. There were similar dislocations in the early 20th century. Again, Max Weber responding to many of those, which is why Max Weber is not a friend of revolutionaries. Okay. Schmitt's response to that is to flush liberalism out of the system, to get rid of it. Okay. And what he's talking about in some ways is what Rachel was talking about with the Leviathan. It's a dictatorship. In fairness, I don't think what Hobbes was necessarily talking about was a modern dictatorship. But I understand why you would say that. In modern terms, the Hobbesian Leviathan would look like, probably, something like what Carl Schmitt is advocating circa 1927, right? And again, if you particularly, I think the two works that characterize that are Political Theology and I think it's called Political Concepts or Concepts of Politics or something like that. I can't remember the exact translation. So he's anti-liberal. He rejects Max Weber and that school of thought. He rejects John Locke. He hates the British system, but he hates it for its hypocrisy, because he witnesses a number of attempts at political reform in Britain. And these attempts at political reform slightly expand the franchise, and things like that. And he says, that's garbage. The whole system is corrupt. The whole borough system, you can buy seats in parliament. It's completely corrupt. And the franchise is meaningless if the institution is founded on corruption, which it is. Get rid of the whole damn thing. Well, that's what the Nazis did. They got rid of the whole damn thing. Not for very long, but they did get rid of it. They destroyed it. Okay? And he advocates that. Why? Is he just a mean, spiteful, hateful, bigoted old man? What's his reasoning? Whether we agree with it or not, what's his reasoning? He's not stupid and he's not insane. It has to do with the way he sees the world.
Well, he brings up the sort of dichotomy between friend and enemy, and
Yes.
in the end, he says that it's justified, but only politically, because he seems to be kind of rejecting any moral or ethical justification of violence in this sense, but that he says it's politically justifiable to sort of exterminate a threat to your way of life.
Absolutely.
His enemy.
And in fact, it's an extrapolation of what he sees as the ultimate justification of violence, which is individual self-defense. You always have a right to resort to violence when you are threatened. Now, what he would say is whether you are an individual and some thug comes up to you on the street, in which case you have a right to beat the shit out of him and kill him. Or if you are a sovereign state of the German people and there are socialists and, you know, labor organizers and Jews and all these undesirable people who are, and liberals too, by the way, they're coming along and they're threatening the safety of the nation state. And so it isn't even about necessarily having a right. The state has a kind of imperative, has to get rid of those things, has to expel them, has to get rid of them. And if it's an opposing nation state, of course it's your enemy. That's the nature of the world. The world is divided into allies and enemies. And today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy because the world is an uncertain place and it's hostile. And he, in his larger works, he kind of tries to explain the basis for that. Okay, why he thinks that's important. But it is exactly what Julian suggested. He looks at the world in very, very, very simple terms. There's like friend and foe, and they're unambiguous for the most part. That's what he's saying. So as a consequence of that, it's easy for him to advocate a dictatorship, a very repressive state. Ultimately, by the way, governed by the same logic as what we see with Max Weber. It's for the good of the people in the state. But beyond that, his advocacy of the dictatorship is justified, paradoxically, by what he purports to believe to be the sovereignty of the people. That for him, the old absolutist leader was not a true dictator because that person did not embody the sovereignty of the people. That is, did not govern in the name of the people. So the modern dictator, for Schmidt, is a dictator in the name of the people, purports to be embodying the will of the people. And that's as far as he takes democracy. And in that sense, it is almost like what Hobbes is talking about with the Leviathan. Because ultimately, the Leviathan that's described, particularly in Book 1, that's described by Thomas Hobbes, is not just an arbitrary leader, a capricious, leader. Okay, it's an authority, a sovereign authority responsible for the good of the people, governing on behalf of the safety of the people. And Schmidt argues that it requires a dictator to do that. That there is that sovereign imperative that law doesn't create and that is insufficient. In other words, it's not enough to be a society governed by law. Someone in a position of sovereignty has to have the latitude to decide when and how to apply that law. And also has to have the authority from time to time to act in what otherwise would be extra legal ways because the existing situations demand it. That's a dictator. And that is the case primarily, as I say, in those two books on, political theology and political concepts, that that's what he argues, that, that you can't have a system that survives and thrives if you don't have that. What do you think? Do we have that in the United States? Well, I mean, does the President of the United States have the capacity to act as a dictator? I've gotten at least 4 different gestural responses to that.
I was going to say, I would say so. Yeah, I definitely would say so.
On the basis of what? Now, I'm not disagreeing.
In certain capacities, like especially if the president were to declare martial law, it allows the president more authority to act as a dictator would.
Well, does it require the declaration of martial law?
No, I think that there's still, I just think that that's one avenue in which it makes it easier, but I think that there's still methods in which the president could act as a dictator, especially that, at least in my opinion, the concept of a presidential impeachment is not legitimate. It's not a legitimate threat to the president. So there's not much preventing them from acting like a dictator.
Well, the only way it would be a legitimate threat to the president was if one party or the other had an overwhelming majority.
Exactly.
A super majority, and that's not liable to happen. But all right, well, a number of people argued that the last 4 years were an attempt by a president to act as a dictator. Now let's think about that, okay? But let's think about it not in some hyper-emotional way, but in the way that Schmitt would have wanted us to think about it, okay? The argument for Schmitt is that, the dictator has to exercise has the capacity to exercise extra legal authority. That sounds like Bill Barr in his notion of presidential sovereignty, the idea of, the singular executive having this extraordinary power. That's the argument that Barr has always made. By the way, he didn't start that with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump didn't start that thinking. Barr was making that argument when he was the very young Attorney General for George H.W. Bush. Okay. That is very much an argument that is informed by much of the thinking of legal scholars like Carl Schmitt. Okay. So there's that. Okay. Did the previous president attempt to act in ways that were extra legal? That should be an easy one. There's no question. Okay, this is important. I'm sorry, go ahead. Whoever I just stepped on.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, well, I guess it depends on like how you want to say it, like influencing people or going outside of like your legal means to like the Capitol riot. If you want to make the argument that he was inciting that riot, you could say that that's an extra legal mean, I think.
Well, I don't even think we have to go that far.
Probably not.
I mean, when you look at, for example, think about the whole notion of building the wall and all that. First of all, there was never really solid majority support for that anywhere in the country. I mean, there was not a point in time when he was president where, say, 60% of the American people agreed with his approach to that. Okay. More importantly, there was never a moment of his presidency where as much as 50% of the country approved of the job he was doing as president. And again, that could be seen as one mechanism of at least kind of consent once removed. Yeah, we think you're doing a good job, go ahead. Trump did not do well with that, okay? But not only that, but on the advice of a lot of people close to him in the office of the president, as opposed to in his cabinet, he did try a number of ways to secure funding for that. And also he made a lot of claims about that were either patently false or were illegal. Okay, would have been illegal had they been allowed. Okay. There's every indication that he did try to act in coordination with foreign governments to influence the outcome of domestic elections. If he did, that's a crime. Now remember, he thought those were perfect phone calls and perfect letters and perfect this and perfect that. He was clear that he didn't care if people thought that was illegal. If they did, what was it? It was the deep state. Well, the deep state is the permanent bureaucracy. That's all it is. It's the political professionals who work 20, 30, 40 years for government. Beyond that, the notion of a deep state is a QAnon fantasy, but which ironically began back in the 60s and 70s on the left, when it was real, like COINTELPRO really happened. Okay, that was against the left for the most part. And so we can say there was an attempt by someone to do that. Now we'd have to go back to Schmitt and say, all right, can we make the case that he was acting as the embodiment of the will of the people? Now, would that be his claim publicly? Whatever I'm doing to make America great again, to bring us back from the evil precipice of liberalism and the Democrats and whoever else I don't like today. Yes, he made that argument constantly. The problem with that is, and this is something that was not anticipated by Schmitt any more than it was necessarily anticipated by Weber, is that we've got all kinds of mechanisms of measuring public opinion. And however imperfect they are, they do give us an idea of what the levels of support are for certain kinds of policies or actions at certain kinds of times. And there was almost never an instance where these kinds of extra-legal or quasi-legal actions by that president were approved by a majority of the people. But that's not, remember, that's not the only guideline. Can we make the case that he was acting for the good of the people, for the good of the republic? Because if we can, then we'd have to say, however reluctantly, even though we may not like the notion of dictators, we'd have to say, well, Schmitt would say, yeah, that's why we need dictatorial power, to save the republic from itself, for example. Can we say that? Can we look at things and say, well, on balance, yeah, he improved significantly the position of the United States in the world, or its stability at home, or whatever.
I would say, like, whether or not he did or didn't on that side, like, you're kind of saying that the sovereign is like, what they do is essentially right because it's for the good of the state, whether or not the result, I guess, was positive or negative for the state. So it's like he's still acting on behalf of the state. We've given him that power. So he is in that sense, like, we have no control of that. He is doing right in the sense that he's trying to do what's best for the state in that sense. Mind you, I do not support Trump, but I'm just
No, that's not the point though.
Yeah.
This isn't about whether, you're right. This isn't about whether or not anybody supports Trump. Okay.
Right.
I don't know how much of a personal fan of Adolf Hitler Carl Schmitt was, but the notion of that kind of star chamber authority to do what thou wilt, so long as you can say you embody the sovereign will of the people. It's kind of hard to argue, at least, that Trump wasn't arguing that when he bothered to. Then we'd have to say, well, is there evidence, in fact, that he really believed that? And this is where it breaks down a little bit, because we know from what little has been leaked or discovered or outed by people who left the administration, that his primary motivation for almost everything he's done, as far as we could tell, was his own brand or his own aggrandizement. That's different. That's not what Carl Schmitt was talking about. In other words, what Schmitt's not talking about was a dictator who would come in and carry out actions that would enrich that dictator in some way or another, that would enhance their financial situation, that would enhance their prestige or their image or whatever. That's not what he's talking about. But here's the problem with Schmidt. What's to prevent any dictator from doing that? Because if your authority is extra legal, what stops you?
He doesn't mention any like sort of restraints, as far as I can tell. Like there's nothing. You know, he's kind of. I guess well, he does talk about. Or maybe I'm getting him confused, but like the ideal versus. You know what I might be thinking about. Am I thinking about Weber, where it's like the ideal versus the actuality, like kind of like the result? I think I might be thinking about.
I think that's
Weber on this one.
really more Weber.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, part of the problem is I understand too that you've been giving like this little tiny flavor of an extraordinary, in terms of volume, body of work from Carl Schmitt. But the problem for a lot of people with Schmitt is that he doesn't acknowledge, for example, the question of competency. Okay, one of the things about the rule of law that Schmitt either denies or ignores is the legal requirements of competency. Okay, when you think about, for example, the president has to be certain things. The president has to be minimum of a certain age. It has to be born in the United States, and and then there are certain guidelines that you can't commit high crimes and misdemeanors, and there are certain things that a president is not supposed to be able to do. There are certain constraints on even the authority of a president, however ambiguous they may be. They're technically there, although there are very few enforcement mechanisms. The 25th Amendment, all right, let me just finish my point, Jillian, and then I'll get you. The 25th Amendment is an attempt to use the law to ensure competency. Okay, those are checks on sovereign authority. Now, again, they don't stop the competent sovereign from exercising power. Those are attempts to stop the sovereign who falls off the rails. Okay, sorry, Julian, go ahead.
I was just going to bring up that this is something that we have seen with many of the thinkers that we've considered so far, that they sort of have a room for contingency sort of in their theories, that it matters whether true belief and intent is, well, true to whoever's executing it. Like you were saying, we can't really tell whether, for example, Trump believed that what he was doing was really what was best. But if he said that, if he used that to justify what he was doing, then I think Schmitt would be like, yeah, I mean, he clearly believes that what he's doing is what's best. And so therefore he should have the ability to do those things, where I think Weber and Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty were like, you can't really use that though, because it's not certain.
That's right. And there's too much of that room for ambiguity. This is why of all the existentialists I've read, the one who gives you a kind of, a star by which to navigate in terms of morality is Beauvoir, with this notion of freedom. By that metric, it's pretty easy to argue that the Trump administration was not acting on behalf of the people. But again, that's not the metric we use. We don't talk really meaningfully in the United States about whether or not Americans are more or less free than they were a year ago. We don't talk like that. You know why? Because most of us don't care. We're more interested in whether or not our paycheck's bigger. Most Americans, really, let's be fair, don't have some conscious sense of wanting to take on more responsibility. Guess what freedom is? More responsibility. And so this is why someone like a Carl Schmitt would come along and say, well, then give the power to someone who wants to make those decisions. And the rejection of that for a lot of people is, how do we know that that person's competent? Is it always the case that the one who wants most to lead is the most qualified leader? No, we know that's not true. We know that's not true. Okay. And so again, I'm not interested in either accepting or dismissing any of these thinkers out of hand. And as I mentioned early in the class, my interest in any of these discussions is not to get you to think in terms of who's a good philosopher or who's a bad philosopher. I think that is a question not worth answering. The idea is, what can we learn? Because the assumption is all of these are very intelligent people. All of them are pretty deep thinkers. And yet they don't all think the same way, even when confronted with the same data. They think differently. They interpret differently. They tell a different story. And what we're trying to figure out is, okay, well, what can we learn? There's a lot you can learn from someone like Schmitt, even if you find repellent the things that he's advocating. Same thing with Thomas Hobbes, or for that matter, John Locke or Karl Marx or anybody else. There's always something you can learn, even if it's what not to do, you know. The presidency of Donald Trump, for someone who does what I do for a living, was fundamentally instructive. Okay. It was a painful lesson in a lot of ways, but it was fundamentally instructive. It told us a lot about the American people. It told us even more about the Republican Party and about the leadership of both parties, and a lot of things that a lot of us didn't really want to know that we now, if we choose to look, we now know. Okay. Needed to happen. Now, will anything come of that? We don't know. We don't know. Okay, but yeah, this is, I mean, we covered a lot of material today, even though we only looked at those last three thinkers. That we covered the waterfront in terms of this notion of how we understand, and more importantly, how we reject or accept the coercive power of the state, the power of the state to use violence against people outside the state or people within the boundaries of that state. Okay, you have to decide for yourselves if you have a personal philosophy about that. I have no interest at all in trying to influence that, except by way of allowing you to discover some of these other ideas. Like, you know, John was saying, yeah, I'd never read Schmitt before. How many of you, by the way, have ever encountered Carl Schmitt? If you were a university student, let's say going back to the 50s or 60s, and you were studying political theory, you would have read Carl Schmitt. I think a lot of people reject Schmitt because of the Nazi association and everything else. And again, I can find repellent a lot of what he's saying, but it's incredibly instructive. It tells me a lot about German intellectual life at the time that he was writing. And most of what I've read in the run-up to Nazi Germany, I now understand to be struggling with and ultimately rejecting violently all the assumptions of liberalism. Okay, that philosophy was destroyed, or the attempt was made to destroy that philosophy, more so there than anywhere else in the country. Liberalism was warped forever, everywhere in the world as a consequence of the Depression and the Second World War in particular. But in Germany, there were real fundamental skepticisms about it. I mean, you can go back to Karl Marx. If you read On the Jewish Question, he's telling you the ultimate failure of liberalism is that while it emancipates people politically, it does not emancipate them as human beings, because it ties them into this, you know, this nexus of exploitation and the pursuit of profit. And the capitalist imperative is to exploit. Okay. To see human beings as means to an end. That's not freedom. Not for Marx, you know, is it freedom? Okay. Again, it doesn't matter what you think about Marx. It compels you to think about liberalism in a different way if you read On the Jewish Question. Okay. Anything else? I was really happy with this discussion. I like the ideas. I like the thinking. I think this class has really kind of caught fire. I was worried in the first week or so. I was like, well, are they going to be interested in this stuff? Are we going to be able to get this going? Because some of the reading's a little dense, but it seems like most of you are beginning to kind of be able to surf it pretty comfortably. Okay. Anything else? Okay, then two things. One, be sure the best time, by the way, to do these notes is right after, if at no other time, right after we've gotten done discussing them. Okay, if not during the discussion. Okay, but do take care of those notes. Don't make me worry about you. The other thing is you have to enjoy your weekend, because I think the weather's going to be fabulous. So you got to get out and have some fun. All right, anything else? Okay, then I'll see you next week.